Why shouldn't you buy the Canon R6 for wildlife photography? I can't think of a single reason. Hi, I'm Phileas Steyn and I'm the Safari Expert. And I know that title was a little bit misleading, but let's be honest, you clicked on it because you're actually considering buying a Canon R6 for wildlife photography. So this should be good news because I actually really do mean it when I say I can't think of any reason not to get one. In fact, I actually bought one myself last year, and the reason I'm showing you the box instead of the camera is because I'm actually recording this video with my R6. So what happened was this. In October last year, my friends at Outdoorphoto were kind enough to send me a Canon R6 and a Canon 100 to 500mm RF lens to test on a 2-week-long adventure through Botswana. And if you haven't watched those videos, I'll link to them above. Now, I enjoyed the camera so much on that trip that the day I arrived back in Pretoria, I went to Outdoorphoto and I just traded in my old Canon 5D Mark IV and I got myself the brand new R6. Now, since I got back, I also tested it extensively on my photographic safaris. So today I thought I'd share with you the 5 things that I like most about the R6 and that I think makes it worthwhile getting it for wildlife photography. But before I do so, as always, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment at the end. And also remember to check out the video description where you'll learn more about Outdoorphoto as well as my best-selling online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs, where I discuss everything from equipment, settings, light and composition to creativity and also animal behavior. Right, here are 5 things that I love about the Canon R6, along with a little bonus reason why I love it for wildlife photography right at the end. Number 1, autofocusing. Getting sharp focus can be a little bit challenging for us as wildlife photographers because we don't necessarily always know what our subject's going to do next. It could be moving very fast or very erratically, and then there's often a lot of clutter in the foreground, things like grass and leaves that want to steal our focus. So the better the autofocusing system of a camera, the better the chance of getting good photographs. Now, in the past, with a lot of the old DSLRs, you had a limited amount of focus points, typically in the middle or towards the middle of the frame. But with the Canon R6, you now have over 1,000 focus points and it's spread right across the frame. And that just means that it's easier to pinpoint your focus, and you can even do that kind of at the corners of the frame. And that's really helpful for composition. Another thing that I like about the focusing of the R6 is that over and above those 7 standard autofocusing methods, from the spot focusing all the way through the clusters to the larger zones, you now have subject tracking as well. And that basically detects things like heads and faces and even the eyes of animals and people. Now, it is important to mention here that it doesn't always work 100% when you're trying to track animal eyes. I even found that on one of the Canon websites, when it talks about the animal eye tracking, it actually says in brackets, dogs, cats, and birds. And so obviously they tested this a lot on pets. And I have found that it struggles, for instance, with animals like leopards that have lots of dark spots, or even impalas that have dark noses and sort of dark ear tips. And sometimes the focus points want to jump to those spots as opposed to the eyes specifically. But that's why I use these 2 autofocusing methods, the standard method where you choose your focus point together with the eye detection in combination with each other. And that's very easy to set up on the R6. I've done that basically by setting up 2 of the back buttons. So what I'll do is when I find an animal, I'll try the eye tracking, and if it doesn't pick it up immediately or accurately, I'll simply move my thumb and go back to the standard single focus point that I can then move around. And sometimes all you need to do is to quickly get that single focus point close to the animal's face and then move over back to the tracking, and it'll pick it up quickly. So you're basically teaching the camera and helping it to lock onto the eye. I have found, however, that it works very well for most species and especially for birds in flight, which is obviously a massive advantage for something that often moves very fast across our frame. Now, speaking about moving those focus points around, obviously we've been able to use our touchscreen at the back to focus for a long time, but the R6 has a really nice touch and drag system whereby you can activate certain parts of the LCD screen and then literally, instead of using the joystick at the back, simply slide your thumb onto the screen and then use the top right-hand corner to move the focus point across the whole frame. And for those of you that do a lot of wildlife photography, you'll know that the quicker you can get your single focus point in the right place, the better the chance of getting your shot. The second thing that I love about the Canon R6 is the fast burst rate. Having fast burst rates are important again because we're photographing subjects that we expect might be moving, and often moving very fast. So very often, because we're photographing animals that are walking, running, or birds flying or taking off, we need a sequence of shots in very short succession to make sure that we get that one image that looks perfect. Very often the shots in between the best ones look very awkward, where the animal might be falling over itself a little bit, or it's got its eyes closed, or its ears back, or maybe a bird in flight has covered its face with its wing. So a fast burst rate definitely increases your chances of getting that perfect shot. Now on the Canon R6 you can get up to 12 frames a second in RAW if you use the mechanical shutter, where you hear the little clicks, and up to a whopping 20 frames a second in RAW completely silently if you use the electronic shutter, and that only buffers after 240 frames. Now if you ask me, that is more than enough. And let me show you a series of photographs that I took recently of some whiteback vultures coming to land at a carcass, and I only used 12 frames a second to get this wonderful sequence. Now, as you can see, because we photographed at such a high frame rate, a lot of these photographs look very similar. So if we look at them one by one, they look very, very similar. But there certainly are small differences. For instance, here you can actually see that this eye is semi-closed, and that's obviously a photograph that we won't use. And then if we move on a little bit, the vulture approaches the horizon, which certainly doesn't look nice for the composition. But because we were photographing at 12 frames a second, if we go through the whole selection, there's going to be one specific photograph that looks better than the rest. And I think it's going to be this one. But you'll see here, the wing comes over, and that's the awkwardness that I was talking about earlier, where the wing kind of goes over the face. There it looks a little bit better again. But then obviously at some stage you start dealing with some background clutter and the other vultures in the carcass itself when it approaches landing itself. Now in this sequence, this is the photograph that I like best. It's an edited version, and as you can see, because of that fast frame rate, I was able to get not only an excellent pose with the subject, but also a nice background. This is obviously also very handy when you photograph birds taking off. And typically what happens when you have slower frame rates is you'll have the first photo is the bird sitting down, and then the second photograph might be the one in the air, but not necessarily a good pose. And then the third one is the bird being chopped off at the edge of the frame. Whereas with a higher frame rate, you just have that much better chance of getting a nice pose of the bird in mid-air before it gets chopped off. The third thing that I love about the Canon R6 is its image quality. Now, I must admit, one of the things I was a little bit nervous about when I first got the Canon R6 was the size of its sensor, which is only 20 megapixels. Many of you might wonder, why didn't I go for the Canon R5, which has a 45 megapixel sensor? Now, the first reason is I've worked with these cameras before that have these massive sensors like the Nikon D850. And even though you have the luxury of cropping a lot, the file sizes are massive. So they're slow to open up and they take up a lot of hard drive space, not to mention memory card space when you're actually taking photographs. So what I must say, what I love about these 20 megapixel files is that they upload very quickly and they take up very little space. And I must admit, 20 megapixels is still a relatively large image. So there is a little bit room for cropping, and all I've learned to do is really to concentrate on my composition and to make sure that I get it right when I first take the photograph. I certainly couldn't justify spending nearly double the money to get the R5 instead for those extra 25 megapixels. When it comes to image quality, the one thing that I know all wildlife photographers want to know is how the camera handles low light. Now let me show you a photograph that I took recently in the Greater Kruger at Mala Mala Game Reserve of a leopard that we found just before dark. Now as you can see, this photo was taken in aperture priority, which is what I typically use for wildlife photography, with the ISO set to 6400. Now let's see what it looks like when we zoom in. The photograph came out nice and sharply, and as you can see, there's very little noise around it. And if that little bit of noise does bother you, it's very easy to remove in Lightroom or something like Topaz Denoise AI. Now on my Canon 5D Mark IV, which I had before, and that was known for great low light capabilities, I actually capped it at 3200 when it came to the ISO. But now being able to cap it at 6400 and not having to worry at all about significant noise is absolutely fantastic. And what that means, if I use auto ISO and I suddenly lose light, I know that I'm still going to get a relatively fast shutter speed because the ISO can jump that high. Every now and again when it's extremely dark and those conditions call for it, I do go over 6400 and I'll use 12,800 or even higher, but then I will do a little bit of noise reduction afterwards. Another aspect of image quality that's very important to me as a wildlife photographer is the camera's dynamic range. And I can best explain that through an example. So to oversimplify it, the dynamic range of the camera is basically its ability to capture detail in the dark or the light areas. So in this example of two elephants where the subject is very dark, I might want to turn it into a high key image like this, where I turn it to black and white and then grossly overexpose the image. And it's the detail that the camera then captures in these dark areas that's important to me. So if I quickly edit this photograph, I'm going to push up the exposure a little bit along with a bit of the shadows until it goes very gray. Then I'm going to push up that clarity to bring out detail and texture and then dehaze it a little bit together with a little bit of a contrast punch. If I now zoom in, this detail that it captured in the dark areas is what I'm looking for. And as you can see in this example, it captured the detail beautifully. I must be honest, I haven't had a huge amount of opportunity to photograph animals in high contrast to really test the dynamic range, but I'll show you another example of some baobab trees that I photographed at Kubu Island on that same Botswana trip in October last year. So to show you the dynamic range, if I underexpose this photograph, you'll see that the camera actually beautifully captured a lot of blues in the light areas. And if I overexpose, it captured beautiful detail in the bark of the trees that again, I could then make a very nice high key photograph. Like that. The Canon R6 is certainly on par, if not better, than my Canon 5D Mark IV when it comes to dynamic range. The fourth thing that I love about the Canon R6 is its design and functionality. So you may have heard the term camera ergonomics. And what that roughly means is basically the design of the camera and the feel of the camera in your hands. And then importantly, where all the buttons are and how you use them. And I must say with the Canon R6, I think they designed it extremely well. And what I mean by that is they've placed the buttons and the dials in really kind of, let's call it user-friendly positions. You never have to wonder what to press to get a certain result. And if you want to change it, all the buttons and dials are extremely customizable. And what I mean by extremely is you can assign a great number of functions or tasks to any specific button. And that just means that you can set up that camera to work exactly the way that you want it to. I also like the size and the weight of the camera. It's light and small. And for me, that was one of the reasons I wanted to go across to mirrorless. I also really like the flip-out LCD monitor. Now, for those of you that haven't used one before, you might be thinking to yourself, where would you ever use that in wildlife photography? Well, the answer is, these days we often rest our camera on a beanbag, whether that be in a hide or the side of your car, and sometimes it's hard to get right behind the camera. Now in that case, you can just flip open that LCD screen, look at it from the top, and then not only focus, but also take your photograph by simply tapping on the back of the screen. Other times you might want to be creative in your composition by photographing animals from a very low angle. Like when we photographed these elephants at water level on the Chobe River, which gave us a result that looked like this. Here, the base of the camera was literally touching the water, and the only way to compose it nicely and to get that horizon straight was to flip open an LCD screen. Here's another example of photographing a dung beetle at eye level. And just look how nice it looks when you use this creative technique. Again, having that flip out LCD screen makes composing this shot 1,000,000 times easier than if you didn't have one. By the way, this is exactly the sort of stuff that I cover in my online course. So if this is the sort of stuff that you want to learn, make sure to go and check it out in the description. Another thing that Canon got right when they designed the R6 was the electronic viewfinder. Because I remember when the EOS R first came out and I tested it for the first time, it really felt extremely weird to look through that electronic viewfinder. Because remember, there's now no mirror in the camera. It almost made me a little bit nauseous to look through it, and it just didn't look the way that it looked when you look through a DSLR. Now, obviously, as technology has advanced on the Canon R6, the electronic viewfinder not only activates instantaneously, but it looks as good as it used to through a DSLR. And on top of that, you now have something called exposure simulation, which basically allows you to see the exposure compensation when you look through the electronic viewfinder. Now, basically, it means you don't have to do what you had to do in the past. We had to press playback, chimp a little bit, and then see whether you over or underexposed enough. Now you can simply change your exposure and see the effect through the electronic viewfinder, which means you're going to miss less shots. And then last but not least, when it comes to the camera design and functionality, one thing that I know a lot of you are worried about is the battery life. Now, I can safely say that the Canon's LP E6NH battery has fantastic battery life, and I've never run out of battery on game drive. And I don't use a battery grip. I just make sure that I charge those batteries every evening like I usually do, and I always carry a spare with me. And then the fifth and final thing that I love about the Canon R6 is that it's got a 5-axis internal image stabilization system. And this works in conjunction with the image stabilizer of the lens. And what that means is you've got a much greater chance of getting sharp photographs in low light when you hand hold the camera. And believe me, as someone that does a lot of video work as well, that is a massive bonus. And that's basically the bonus that I wanted to mention to you right at the end of the video, as promised in the beginning. And that's that the Canon R6 is fantastic for filming wildlife as well. If you want to see the amazing video clips you can take with the Canon R6, go and watch that Botswana series I mentioned at the beginning, because on that 2-week trip, we had some incredible opportunities to film lions and leopards and elephants at amazing places like Nxai Pans and Khwai. And obviously, it's that amazing animal eye tracking focusing system and the overall great autofocusing system that played a big part in getting these amazing video clips. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Doing so will greatly help the popularity of the video and hence also increase the chances that other people that might want to buy one will see it on YouTube. You're welcome to ask me any questions you might have about the R6, or even share with me some of the features you like or even dislike about this camera. Also remember to check out the 2 links in the video description, one to Outdoorphoto and the other one to my online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs. Thanks for watching and see you next time.